So the task that was assigned for Group 4 was to explain the relationship from the 1850s to the 1960s between the U.S. and the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Panama. I'm going to start off with the Dominican Republic. It actually has the most information in the book that we read, but beginning in the 1850s, it was under the rule of Pedro Santana. He ran into a couple of emissaries such as John Hogan and William Casno. Um, but with John Hogan, he created a deal that allowed the U.S. Navy to refuel their ships. And there was a thought of annexing the Dominican Republic. Um, However, it wasn't until William Casno actually came in to actually establish a plan for an annexation. Um, it was on Santana's mind before, but it was dismissed originally when Hogan had came. So once Casno came back, they were kind of in favor of it. It was, when I say they, I mean the U.S. and the Dominican Republic. Um, the reason was because it was the Dominicans were at war with the Haitian oligarch rule, and they didn't want to keep on continuing to fight, and they figured that having the U.S. Annex the land would help them with these issues. So this was presented to Grant, Ulysses Grant, and he signed an annexation treaty with Buenaventura Valles, which allowed the migration of American blacks after the Civil War. Um, Not very many people were happy with it when it was signed, and so they tried to overthrow Valles. Um, and it created issues that Grant wanted to remedy with the military, but ultimately he didn't allow it. Baez didn't allow it, and so over time the treaty ended up falling apart, and the U.S. lost interest. So ultimately the treaty failed. Once all of these issues with the treaty blew over around the 1880s, American planters saw potential in the Dominican Republic and all of their crops, mainly sugar. And so one of the planters by the name of Alexander Bass and his son acquired crops over the decade, and they established large plantations in most of the Western Hemisphere. Sorry, they created one of the largest plantations in the Western Hemisphere, but it was solely within the Dominican Republic. Um, Another guy by the name of Ulysses Herro came into power, and he became dictator around this time as well. And he was a dictator of the Dominican Republic from here until the end of the century, um, which was when he was assassinated. During this time, he racked up a bunch of debt when he was dictator in lieu of bank control and railroads to um, other people who gave him the loans. They were foreign. Some of them were from New York. Other ones were from Europe. And so when he racked up all of his debt after his assassination, it was when they found out that he had accumulated all his debt and put the economy in a very bad place. And to make matters worse, he was acquiring a lot of this fraudulently through deals that weren't documented and nobody knew about. So then, after his assassination in the late 1800s, um, it this ultimately led to a financial crisis, and the Europeans that were involved with all of his debt, threatened intervention due to the suspension in financial payments. Um, but Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, intervened and took control of the debt, since he was worried that issues would arise with the Panama Canal. Um, Around this time was when the Panama Canal was being planned and made, and so the Dominican Republic had no chance but to concede, and therefore the U.S. had the majority power in restoring the Dominican Republic's economy. That being said, they had to give up a lot of things in order to try to get everything under control. Thanks to Hero, and so when this happened, when the U.S. came in and took over, there was a lot of political violence, and it only increased and never stopped, even after a decade after the U.S. took control. Um, so, with World War One on the rise and the Dominican Republic angry at the U.S. for intervening, um, the the U.S. sent the U.S. was worried that the Dominican Republic would align with other world forces, particularly Germany, and so troops were sent to the Dominican Republic to try to stop any type of aligned forces with other countries, with foreign powers. So over this time, the country gained from the war, World War One, and military improvements were made. However, this being done, um, it created a dependency between the Dominican Republic and the U.S. And to make matters worse, um, the the majority of the U.S. lawmakers were hired by planters that had came over and taken the crops to create legislature that allowed them more land. And over this time, they the they used a lot of the Dominican Republic's people to work on these plantations and gave them mediocre wages. Um, there was nothing they could really do at this time. The people that were ultimately benefiting from it were the planters. And once the war was over, the U.S. evacuated, and a guy by the name of Trujillo took advantage of the U.S. leaving and became dictator. Um, Over this time, as dictator, he tortured and massacred a bunch of Haitians and ultimately became assassinated by the Dominican Republic's people with the help of the CIA after he tried to assassinate the president of Venezuela. So, the majority of the stuff that happened um, was was mainly within the Dominican Republic between the 1850s and the 1960s. Most of the stuff that's in the book regarding Guatemala and Panama, there actually isn't too much. They were here and there, but ultimately, Panama was important because it was the location of where the Panama Canal was built. But the U.S. was interested in a passage in the 1850s. They wanted a canal for increased trade, and um, around the end of that century, the 19th century, um, France had already been working on it, but they stopped because of how dangerous it was. Um, the U.S. was close on acquiring the land which the canal was built around and acquiring it from the Colombians around the 1900s, but hit a snag with Colombian Congress. Colombia was in need of money desperately, so they were going to sign a treaty with the U.S. to sell the plot of land that they needed. But ultimately, Congress put a stop to it and indicated that it would be a threat of security for the country. So Roosevelt didn't like this and ultimately took the land over by force. After it was taken over, it took 10 years to build the canal, and hundreds of thousands of workers migrated from the U.S. to Panama. Um, it was it was one of the biggest engineering wonders of it is one of the biggest engineering wonders of the world, and the canal is currently used today. It's the amount of ships that have crossed through there is has increased in size by tens of thousands. There's tons of ships that go through there today. It was barely used when it was first created because they're still trying to work out the kinks, but ultimately, to build this canal, a lot of lives were lost, and it was overshadowed by the feature of the canal. Um, and so the canal, again, was used mainly to support the two world wars in moving freight. And a lot of the people that worked on the canal ended up staying to work as maintainers. Um, they after a while that they were living there, um, there was separation between the Anglo Americans and the West Indians and Panamanians in terms of like housing and payment, and issues ended up arising and feuds broke out, and um, there still is some tension there, but that was around after the world wars. That's mainly what happened within Panama. It was centralized around the Panama Canal when the U.S. was there. Finally, Guatemala. There was just about like nothing in the book regarding Guatemala, but I think what was significant in the role between Guatemala and the U.S. were mainly the banana plantations. Um, I mean, they had to travel through Guatemala in order to get to Panama in some aspects, and so that was also part of how the U.S. was involved with Guatemala around the 1850s and the 1950s. But ultimately, it was the plantations and how the U.S. took control of a lot of these plantations and kind of just took over and then up and left and destroyed economies and didn't really do much to repair the places that they came in to take over. Um, but yeah, I mean, the majority of the things they're all kind of associated to one another, um, mainly because of the U.S. But during that time, those were the biggest influences between the U.S. and those three countries.